Mr. Awegbara, hold on to your thought. But Mr. Johnson, if, for instance, oil prices do come down to $80, as it's looking like might likely happen in the next couple of days, except OPEC actually gets up and does something about, cutting, putting its foot down in terms of pricing. What then happens? We do not have enough to save if we put our benchmark at $78. And Mr. Awegbara, talked very broadly about where the issues has always been the West wanting to always be in control of oil prices, oil, whether from China or whether from anywhere. And you've seen an increase in production of shale oil. And so it doesn't profit anybody if oil actually begins to fall the way it's falling.
Okay, I will address two issues. One is the issue of conspiracy of the Western countries against oil producing countries. I don't think that's the substance of that issue. Basically, what happens in oil sector, which happens in virtually every commodity, is that you have a boom and bust cycle. And this is what drives the boom and bust cycle, because we need to understand this basic economics. When the prices are high, a lot of factor inputs come into that sector and ratchet up the volume of supply. If oil prices are being $110 or $120, a lot of wells that were not profitable at lower prices become more profitable, and then exploration increases, and then technology also goes into that sector to begin to extract, for instance, shale gas that production is about $70 to $190. Because oil price is very high, so you find out that the cost, even in a country like Venezuela, which is the country with the largest oil deposits, but because they have heavy crude, the cost of extraction is very high in their country. When you have a commodity price above certain threshold, and people are beginning to make what you call economic rent, factor inputs go into that sector to produce that product, and then that will increase supply. But the supply, because supply is coming to the market, will exceed demand, and once demand is exceeded, supply exceeds demand, prices will begin to prices will crash. And as prices crash, those inputs, those products that are being produced at suboptimal costs will be withdrawn out of the market, and that's why you're seeing the boom and bust cycle in virtually all asset classes. As long as you have prices at extraordinary high level that give producers what you call economic rent or extraordinary profit, a lot more factors will get into that sector to produce that product, and that will hit the market and supply will exceed demand. When supply exceeds demand, prices will crash, and now you have the bust. And then when prices crash, producing becomes unprofitable, and a lot of inputs are withdrawn from that sector. But that's for another topic, another discussion. But your question is this: what do we do in a situation where oil price drops below $80, which is a possibility, like we said? Several factors have to come in. If we're not careful, if oil price drops, like I said, if oil price drops below current level of 86, we're going to have a current account deficit according to the Renaissance Capital report. And if you have a current account deficit at the period when you're having financial account deficit, you're going to have a negative balance of payment, which will lead to you financing your negative balance of payment from your reserve, and that will quickly erode the reserve. If the reserve is quickly eroded, we may get into what we call fiscal shock, the kind of thing that happened in Ghana this year, where the country had to devalue its currency. Okay, devalue its currency because, unfortunately for us, the structure of our consumption is that we still import a lot of our products, our consumables, and because that some of the consumption is inelastic, the increase in price may not necessarily lead to a proportional reduction in volume consumed. Then you might have a fiscal shock because your consumption continues, but you do not have the revenue to finance that consumption or the revenue to pay for those imports. And you're going to have a situation where you devalue your currency. The minister said yesterday that we are not in a crisis situation. I agree with her. We are not in a position where we can say we will begin to imagine we will not pay salaries. Of course, that will be the last thing that the government that we affected. But a couple of factors we could affect. You could have a slowdown in economic development, particularly fiscal infrastructure development, which my colleague alluded to. Because what happens is that when your revenue drops, the first thing you cut is on what you may call discretionary expenditure. And in a situation of this nature, one of the first discretionary expenditure the federal government has to cut down will be on capital expenditure, because you cannot afford not to pay employee salaries. But the challenge you have is this: when you cut down on capital expenditure, then two things will happen. your GDP growth rate will go down. The real sector of the economy will begin to suffer. The level of unemployment will drop, or the level of unemployment will increase. And then even the other tax revenue, the government had budgeted a 3.55 trillion from tax revenue.
Yeah, so let me now go to Mr. Awegbara on that one. Let me take Mr. Awegbara up on that. So, Mr. Awegbara, thank you so much for staying with us. Now, Mr. Chukwu was actually going to talk about the non-oil revenue target, which is 3.55 trillion naira. Now, is this a realistic assumption, especially going by what we see, the present realities on ground?
Now, let me make one reference clear here, because if not, we should not understand the problem. As Mr. Chukwu said about the boom-bust thesis, it is good as is stated in the textbook, and it's clearly stated in the textbook that way, but that's not how it happens. Two, let me make it clear to you also that if the global economy is recovering, and the oil price was higher when the global economy was bad, and it's not recovering, how come the price of oil has to drop when the global economy has recovered and many people are now consuming oil? So, having said that, now let me say this, that it is good even that this is happening to the Nigerian economy. You know why? Now we must go into internally generated revenue as a source of revenue for our budget. Because our internally generated revenue ratio to the budget is very, very low, which means all the leakages in the revenue side, in the internally generated revenue side, will now be closed. Two, we put a closure or a stop to import duty waivers. Because there are so many leakages in the economy that if we close these leakages in the economy, and if we increase the tariff on imported goods so that local manufacturers will have opportunity to make these goods locally, then the economy will eventually, this will be a blessing in disguise. So what I'm saying in essence is not the theory we are formulating here, but how do we actually do with this job? What we need to do is the government to increase its revenue side through internal generated revenue by putting a closure to all the leakages, and possibly to address the issue of importation of oil, because that puts a lot of pressure on the economy. Also address the problem of importation of food that we are supposed to be producing in Nigeria. So if we do this, I will tell you that by now Nigeria should not be wholly basing its budget annually on oil, because it is mind-boggling that a country after 54 years is still basing its annual budget on oil.
Mr. Awegbara, hold on to your thoughts.
My proposal is that
let's take a quick break.
let this be a blessing in disguise. Meaning that
you're watching Business Morning on Channel 7. On the program today, we'll be looking at 2017 medium-term expenditure framework and fiscal strategy paper. We'll be focusing mainly on the oil aspect, which is one of the biggest heartaches at the moment, because global oil prices have been fluctuating at the moment. Oil prices are actually lower than where they were in June, which is at $86 per barrel. As at June, it was around $115 per barrel, and this is cause for concern for Nigerians, because that is what our mainstay is, oil. Even though we know that the administration is trying very hard to diversify the economy, but for now we're focusing on oil. But when we do come back, we'll take a look at some other aspects of the 2015-2017 MTEF FSP. Join us again.